We have a special guest today for the podcast, although not really a special guest. He is Bill Dunkelberg, NFIB's chief economist, but new to the podcast, the Research Center's podcast, Small Business by the Numbers. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Holly. It's great to be here and great to talk about this wonderful project that we have together.
So, Bill Dunkelberg, it is weird saying Bill Dunkelberg. I have known you for decades now and affectionately called Dunk, which is the nickname that most everybody refers to you as these days, or since I think probably childhood, the nickname Dunk. Is that true?
Works for me.
So you have been NFIB's chief economist since the 70s, and the work that you've done has just been amazing contribution to small businesses in providing information about how that sector of the economy, half the economy, is faring in different economic conditions, so how they adjust business operations and adapt. So I wanted to have you on the podcast to talk a little bit about your history with NFIB and also your background in survey work, how you came up with our Small Business Economic Trends Survey, which is just the staple for data in the small business sector, what everybody goes to look to see how that slice of the economy is doing month to month. So let's start from the beginning. And how did you end up being affiliated with NFIB? How did you meet NFIB when you were the National Federation of Independent Business? I should probably say all the words so everybody knows what we're talking about. But how did you end up knowing about NFIB when you were at Stanford?
Well, we were both born in 1943. I thought that
There
was
you
pretty
go.
good.
Perfect. I love it.
Yeah, NFIB was started in 43 as a counter to the Chamber of Commerce, which was always dominated by the big firms, relatively big, and that put some money in. So to help small businesses have their voice, NFIB was started way back, and if you joined, you couldn't give a lot of money, so the fees for joining were kept very small and tightly controlled to make sure that NFIB was managed by small businesses and not by some big business. So that was their start, and I didn't have much to do with NFIB in 1943, but yeah, I was raised by my mother, my brother, and I. Her goal was we were going to get an education, so I graduated from Michigan and started looking for a job.
As background, you went to undergrad, grad school, PhD, all at University of Michigan. You are a Michigan student through and through.
So 4 years was getting an undergraduate degree, and 5 years was getting a graduate degree. So that's 9 years in college. But those last 5 years, my support came through being a study director at the Survey Research Center at the university. It was a very well-known place. So I had lots of practice doing things like the survey of consumer finances, which is now done by the Federal Reserve, but we did it back in the day. And that was a large survey of a random sample of American consumers, families, about 2,000, in fact, with personal interviews. Somebody from Michigan went to these houses and had interviews with all these people. And it was a very expensive and large scale undertaking, but very popular, especially with a lot of companies who supported the survey since they wanted to know things like, who's buying cars and who's buying dishwashers and who's doing this and who's doing that. And the survey was designed to provide that information. So when I graduated, I got a very wonderful job with the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and that was 1970. While I was working there, I got contacted by a guy by the name of Joe Fee, who had a little organization he called Faculty Associates, which I think was just Joe and a professor, health economics professor at Berkeley. That was Faculty Associates, and then I guess I became another member of that. So there were three in the firm. And so Joe got hooked up with NFIB.
And just for background, NFIB was located in San Mateo, California. And so that's where we
Yeah.
started and owned a building, I believe, off of Sand Hill Road, which is close to where my mom's side of the family is from. So I am very familiar with that area. And it's just kind of amazing to think that that's where it all began for NFIB and that where you met NFIB and became familiar with them while you were at Stanford in that same very local area.
Yeah. Well, Joe had been hired by Wilson Johnson, the president, to go around the United States and interview with a bunch of people to help Wilson figure out how to make NFIB more powerful and more influential in Washington, D.C. But somebody told him that he should talk to Bill Dunkelberg at the University of Michigan, which he then found out Bill Dunkelberg was in San Mateo uh, at Stanford then. So we got together and I got to meet with Wilson and talk with him. And to kind of make a longer story short, I thought, well, how am I going to help Wilson? What advice can I give him? And I found out that NFIB had several 100,000 member firms around the country. And I thought, oh my gosh, well, you got something to get a sample from. I mean, let's find out information from them like we did at the Survey Research Center about families. Let's find out about the small businesses and then use that information, publish it any way we could, see if that helped out. So Wilson bought into that, very visionary guy, and he agreed it would be a good thing to do. And what I did was several projects for NFIB, preparing testimony on the minimum wage, for example, and some other similar efforts where we took specialized samples and designed to give us information to talk about these issues.
So when you were first working with NFIB and looking at the impact some of these policy issues had on small business owners, and you designed the survey that we now use every month to better explain the small business sector. And you drew on that from the survey work at Michigan, because from what I remember, the Michigan survey and NFIB's survey are similarly structured.
Methodologically, yes. What you have to do is to learn about the importance of scientific sampling. If you want to represent a whole body of people, you have to have a representative sample to provide data which you could then say characterizes the whole group. So we had to start teaching our people at NFIB about sampling and the importance of sampling, how to draw a true random sample, what to do with people who refuse to answer, and all those kinds of issues, which we spent a lot of time learning at Michigan. And so we now have a pretty well operationally trained staff at NFIB that kind of knows how to do this stuff correctly, and an growing more difficult market to get data, to get people to take a few minutes and answer the question so that we can have a good response.
Yes, that is certainly one of the challenges of all surveys, including ours. I mean, thankfully, we have a huge pool of small business owners to randomly sample each month, but it is getting more challenging. I mean, we've heard from the federal government surveys, census, other trade associations that have surveys, our surveys. It is more challenging to connect and have business owners or just people in general fill out surveys to get information that helps us better understand what's happening in the economy. But, we're so thankful for our members and the time that they spend in filling out the survey, which is kind of an interesting point because how we disseminate the survey is almost a relic of years and years past because as you said, when you were at Michigan doing your survey and you were doing all of these surveys and talking to people in person, that just seems unfathomable now. I mean, I know that census does this in counting the population and things like that every 10 years, but it is so costly and time consuming that having those face-to-face conversations or even on the phone is almost cost prohibitive to anybody or everybody out there that's in this line of work. And then the step down from that is mail. And we still mail. We know that every small business has an address that we're going to connect to our random sample. And mail, amazingly, still thankfully, has about double the response rates as if we were to email. And so that's been really helpful that NFIB has continued to support financially this great survey work that you created and making sure that we receive as many responses as possible. It is labor intensive still, even with the mail survey. But again, we appreciate all the staff hours that go into it and all of our members who respond to the survey.
And we try to keep the members informed about how we use the data
Absolutely.
to try to benefit their situation. Try to inform regulatory committees about what the world really looks like, not what they imagine it might be like, and show them where the data gets used and when it appears in the press, all that kind of stuff to let them know that this is important and they really should take 5 minutes and answer the questionnaire and send it back to us.
Exactly. I mean, because we do use it in so many ways. We use it in congressional testimony. We use it in talking to the media. We use it in other groups within DC and the states and talking to other organizations or speaking to organizations that invite us to participate in their events. And it's by far the number one tool we have to talk about the small business sector, the reality of what they're dealing with, how they're responding to shocks in the economy. I mean, I remember when I first started and I first met you, Dunk, and it was in the lead up to the financial crisis. So there were a few years when I started working on the survey with you, a few years that it was pretty stable. Things were okay. Then there was a bit of inflation getting built into what we were seeing in our data, and then the financial crash and the Great Recession and how that impacted small business owners, but also how it elevated into a whole different stratosphere the visibility of our survey. And that was really interesting for me to see how that transpired, but I can only imagine for you, it was a time where I think you were in the media in some capacity all the time trying to deliver that message of how this was really impacting small firms. And one of the areas that I thought was interesting is a lot of the attention was on finance and their availability of credit. And because of this survey, that was a part of the story, certainly, but the outsized story that we were all able to talk about was demand fell through the floor. So we went into a recession, sales were down. If sales are down and your business is struggling, financing is probably not top of mind in trying to operate your business. And so I remember that as one of the kind of pinnacle time frames of where our survey really, really made a difference. I'm sure there were many times before that when I wasn't part of the research center, but that was my first visible experience in seeing how the survey changed how people thought of that half of the economy, the small business half of the economy. And it was just truly impressive to see it all transpire and to have this tool available to us. What do you remember, Dunk, about that time?
Well, you characterized it pretty well. Things were very volatile. Our data were really good at reminding people about, or maybe teaching them about, is that small businesses, maybe small individually, but collectively, they're half the economy. And yeah, the financial news may talk about big companies like General Motors, but we got them to think about it in other terms, which is a lot of the parts that go into a car are made by small firms. And guess what? You can't buy a car from Ford. You have to buy it from a dealer, small business that provides all the service that goes with having a car and so on and so forth. So we really highlighted the important role that small businesses have in that whole chain of making something and getting it into the hands of the final consumer.
Absolutely. I mean, part of the supply chain in pretty much every capacity. And as you said, it's, I guess, easier to talk about the larger companies because everybody can kind of wrap their head around GM or Ford at the time, or whether something's happening to other big brand name companies. And then talking about small business, we're talking about the auto body shop, the car dealership, as you mentioned, the laundromat, your local restaurant, your CPA, your accountant, all of those folks that are so important. And you really kind of have to talk about them collectively to get an understanding and then use examples of an individual business to frame what's actually happening, and people can visualize it with an anecdote, a story of the laundromat or of the auto repair shop. But having that aggregated data is so helpful and unique. So when you started off creating the survey, and I know that you and I have talked a number of times about your experience in this and what the intent was at the beginning, and it was to provide information for us NFIB staff to talk about and for the outside world outside of NFIB to better understand the small business sector. But in thinking about where it started to now, how it evolved, is it what you thought it would be?
Well, I guess I would say yes. That's what I hoped would happen, that we wouldn't just have the survey and then we'd sit down at the table and share it with each other. That was that. The whole idea was to get it out there so that the whole world was paying attention to it. And I think that's what we've done now. I think it's just amazing to see the amount of usage of our NFIB data by the big analytic firms on Wall Street that publish, their charts about this and that. NFIB numbers show up all the time. different stuff. And think about the information we have. I mean, we have a huge survey of thousands of firms who tell us that they raised their prices or cut their prices, and by how much. And nobody knows that. You get your CPI measure, which is interesting, as the BLS hires a bunch of people to go shopping truly every month with a list of things they have to find a price on. And then they say, well, here's what we think consumers buy, and that gives them the basket of goods that they price out, and to get the consumer price index out of that. But you want to know something about the dynamics of pricing and where price pressures are coming from. You need to know who is raising or cutting and how much. And that information we can get very nicely in our study.
So, Bill, when thinking about the 52 years of doing the survey, what's been something that has jumped out at you in looking at the data or has been particularly surprising about small businesses and how they adjust in these different economic times?
Well, one thing that I found very interesting is that if you look at our data in detail, you really get good clues about the direction of things in the economy, like prices going up or down, or hiring going up or down, or what the problems are. And we're really a leading indicator, not by a whole lot, not by years, but by months and quarters. You can see changes amongst the small business sector participants that tell you what's going to be happening at the macro level once we add it all up, the way the government adds it up, whichever, which is a complicated process. But I like being able to see the developments and see the trends up and down in hiring and pricing and those kinds of things, monitoring conditions in the capital markets. We did a lot of very special studies about the role of banks in the small business sector. And of course, they're critical there and a major source of credit and dependable source of credit too. So we got to watch all of that. We saw what the impacts of policy, economic policy, as we saw the average rate they paid on a loan reached 19% in the early 80s with the inflation we had then, and watched it come down over the years as the Federal Reserve changed its policies and the economy adjusted. So it was good to watch. We can tell when there's a credit crunch and when there isn't. And again, that's all revealed by how many are complaining or not complaining, how many are hiring or not hiring. All those things give you an early insight into the trends in the economy.
So, throughout all the different economic expansions and retractions and looking at our data, what's been most notable to you? Which economic era, for lack of a better phrase, do you find most interesting in looking at our data and having it reveal how small business owners were adapting?
Well, when things are going bad in the economy. So I would say one interesting time period is the late 1970s and early 1980s with inflation and Volcker at the Fed and all the struggles we had with that. And so there are several time periods that I think it was very useful to have the data. So a lot of our questions are about plans. So very interesting to see what firms are thinking about doing. Then, of course, since we survey every month now, we also get to see what they did do. And I think that's always a very interesting project.
It certainly is. So I don't know that I've actually ever asked you this before, but in 1986, when we transitioned from a quarterly to a monthly survey, Was that your idea? Was that NFIB's president's idea? Whose idea was that?
That was NFIB's idea.
The orders just came through, huh?
Yeah, well, I think Denny Dennis was probably involved in that whole thing.
Yes, true. My old boss, Denny Dennis, and
Yes.
you and
Yeah.
him were the dynamic duo for so many years in the, understanding small business and your collaboration. And it's so fun to read the reports from 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and to see how it's all evolved. And it's been such a great catalog of interesting topics and reports on small business and kind of all the areas that they operate in. But interesting that they decided that we needed something to talk about every month. So it's been such a pleasure working on this survey with you. And you've created this incredible data set and time series. I always joke that in the Research Center through this survey, we talk to more small business owners than probably anybody out there, but it's all on paper and it's all numbers. But hundreds of thousands of small business owners captured how they're operating their business and in the different economic timeframes, which has just been absolutely fantastic. Do you have any specific stories that you talk about, whether it's the most interesting or unexpected person that you've heard talk about our survey?
Well, got a lot of attention from a couple of Fed chairs, which I thought was very good.
I remember being at the National Association of Business Economics, one of their annual meetings, and Ben Bernanke, chair of the Fed, was presenting, and it was the first time that I saw somebody present and highlight our data, and it was on, I believe it was either it was capital spending or one of the employment numbers. But I remember turning to the person that was standing next to me saying, "Oh my gosh, that's NFIB's numbers. That's our numbers." And I think he looked at me like, "Who are you?" And you sound very enthusiastic. But it was so fun to see the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank with a slide showcasing our data and making it a priority to talk about small businesses and how they were doing, and that the Federal Reserve Bank here in DC and all the district banks have our data and use it to form policy and to better understand the economy. And it was just such a thrill to see it
Yeah.
on a
That's one
big
of the nice
screen.
things about your data set that you now manage carefully is that, we can get very specific data over a very specific area. So there are 12 Federal Reserve districts, for example, and we can provide data for every one of them on how the small businesses in the district are doing.
Absolutely. So, Bill, when thinking about wisdom that you or advice that you could give a researcher or hopefully elected officials, those who are looking to represent their district or their state, and they're representing their whole community, including small business owners, what advice would you give them in better understanding small firms, and specifically what should they look at, what should they look for, and how should they conceptualize or understand the small business sector?
Again, looking at the macro data that the government produces about the whole economy, we roughly guess that small businesses account for half of the gross domestic product and about half of the number of people who are working. Well, that's kind of important. Very important part of the economy. And so it really is, again, back to my point about watching things that are coming, because whatever these firms are responding to, you should pay close attention to surveys like ours that talks to a large number of people who are generating that GDP and the jobs out there to see how things are going. It's like monitoring the health, getting a checkup monitoring how well the economy is doing and or not doing, and then anticipating what might have to happen to remedy whatever difficulties are starting to appear.
That is a great note to end on. Thank you for joining us on Small Business by the Numbers. Great conversation. So fun to hear again the history and your participation in creating this wonderful monthly survey, our Small Business Economic Trends Survey, that has been so helpful in NFIB staff and those who are interested in the small business economy to better understand what's happening out there. Thank you, Bill.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for all of your good work and your leadership.